All right, very good. Well, welcome everybody once again. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are here on February the 25th with CScott, who is presenting her final dissertation defense. She is a student in the School of Education at Aspen University. And with her tonight, we have some of her friends, family, and colleagues, as well as her committee. So we've got Dr. William Schleicher, Dr. Shelley Whitman, and myself, Dr. Courtney Grant. And with that, Chris has shared her screen. I'm going to go off camera and off mute, and Chris, you can take it away.
Okay. All right. Well, here is my title of my dissertation, being Equitable Assessments in Middle and High School Science. It is a phenomenological study of educator experiences. And thank you so much to my committee members for being here and guiding me through this process. So according to, I move that out of the way, according to statistics from the US Department of Education, classrooms are becoming increasingly diverse, and a necessity for pedagogical and ethical equity includes that assessments reflect all students' learning, regardless of their background, their language, their learning style. And we are in an era where educational equity is becoming more and more aware, understanding educators' perceptions of equitable assessments in science aids in the process of where learning can be effective and also inclusive. We know that assessments shape teaching, learning, curriculum, policies, and the use of standardized assessments and how data drives these decisions, these resources, allocations, and perceptions of school quality as well. The significance of the study would be the use of assessments being fundamental. They are used to establish students meeting the standards. Traditional assessments are designed to reflect the dominant cultural norms and expectations and fail to account for the varied cultural, linguistic, and the experiential backgrounds that students bring to the classroom. And research has noted that there are disparities and gaps in STEM subject areas, and assessment data with multilingual learners, students with disabilities, the Black, Indigenous, people of color, or the BIPOC students. So this study will be grounded in Freire's theory of critical pedagogy, with the key tenets of that being critical consciousness, learners encouraged to critically analyze their social realities, dialogical learning, which education being a two-way process where learners and educators engage in meaningful discussions. Praxis is the educational community bridging theory and practice and leading to real world societal changes and liberation. And that would be freeing individuals from oppression and leading to student agency and empowerment. My research questions were: how do educators implement equitable science assessment practices in their diverse classrooms, and what barriers do they encounter doing so? My second research question is: how do educators perceive the effectiveness and the implications for student learning and inclusion? My literature review involved looking at the historical roots of education, with the early history talking in the 1600s and the New England colonies, the 1800s with Horace Mann emphasizing the need for universal free education, but those, of course, were only for white families, to the Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, where segregation in public education became unconstitutional. I addressed equality and equity, with equality being that all individuals, all students are given the same treatments and seen as equal persons, while equity in education regards that individual's circumstances. The foundations of science assessments, I talked about purposes, the function and types of science assessment, the alignment with next generation science standards, and the connections to laws and policies like the Every Student Succeeds Act and the Individuals with Disability Education Act. The barriers to equitable assessments include achievement gaps in education and how assessment systems continue to reflect systemic inequities, including structural, pedagogical, and systemic barriers, and looking at students that are multilingual learners, historically marginalized, socioeconomic status, and students with disabilities. And I ended the literature review just talking about equitable learning, equitable assessments, and designing learning strategies that include practices in scientific modeling, engaging in arguments from evidence, and designing solutions using model based phenomena and real world situations. The research and design, this was a phenomenological study, which is a qualitative research approach that focuses on understanding the lived experiences about a specific phenomena and to describe these experiences in rich and detailed ways. The participants, I had 8 of them with the inclusion of teaching at least 5 years. They were public school teachers from 6th to 12th grade. They taught general science, life science, physical science, included teachers that taught AP as well as college and the high school. They are comfortable with aligning student learning to next gen standards, as well as working with students in high stakes accountability. They were all part of the Northwest Education Service District, which is a large area, about 16% of the state in K to 12. I used Proposa sampling to start and speaking with colleagues. And then from there, I went to like Facebook and did snowball sampling via the Ambitious Science Teaching Group. I had site permissions, informed consent. I used pseudonyms. I had a password protected OneDrive file. I also followed EPIKey and member checking to ensure credibility in the process. All right, my data analysis began with Navivo, and I uploaded my transcripts into the process. And in that process, you are highlighting the transcripts for codes and meanings, maybe significant statements. As I began that process, I just was not able to see all of my work in that process. I took everything out, I started again, and just realized that I needed to be able to kind of see everything and work directly from the document. So I switched to manual coding. As part of open coding, I read each transcript many times. I watched the videos, so I became familiar with the nuances as well. I found significant statements and phrases and patterns. I then made connections with my observation notes and my reflective journaling. I followed this with axial coding, where I categorized the initial codes of the participants into broader categories, concepts and possible themes. And then I did my theme analysis and development, where I captured the perceptions and the experiences with equitable assessment practices. It was iterative, it was continually being refined through comparison across the information to make sure that that data was grounded and the final themes reflected the commonalities and the differences seen that science educators understood and experienced. For the ethical considerations, I followed the Belmont report with respect for persons, using informed consent, beneficence. I cared for their well being, allowing them to skip questions if they needed. For justice, I used the equitable selections of educators with NGSS experience and amplified their voices. And then I maintained confidentiality as part of trustworthiness. The credibility, I used member checking, I used direct quotes. For dependability, I had the transcripts, I used security. It was an iterative process. Transferability gave me the participants teaching context. I documented my procedures so that it could be replicable by maintaining the documents. And then confirmability, I had an audit trail. I was sure that the responses were shaped by the participants' responses. This is just another view of my data analysis process. The fact that I took those words from initial phrases and built the descriptive codes from there. I then took statements and further coded them into broader categories. I refined them then into core themes with shared meetings from the participants, making connections between the themes and between the research questions. And that led to the 4 conceptual groups. The foundations of the equitable assessments from the participants came to 2 principles that I saw in all interviews, regardless of their experience or what curriculum they used or what they taught. For my results for research question 1, I ended with 4 themes. And so in theme 1, that would be where it was defined the equitable assessment methods were giving students varied and flexible ways to show their understanding. And it's important that it wasn't about just offering choices, but it really was fundamentally reconceptualizing what counts as evidence. They included giving opportunity for students to engage in sense making as an active part of their assessments. And this also gave insight to the teachers. The second theme was the equitable assessment practices that were tailored to specific student populations, such as students that were multilingual learners or students with disabilities. These were more common options and supports that were available, but they were time intensive for the educators. And as classroom populations became more heterogeneous, the limitations from the traditional assessment approaches became more visible and was part of the driving for their search for more equitable practices. Just to note, when it came to BIPOC students, their practices were intentional, but there also was uncertainty, like, do traditional assessments cause harm? The curriculum that supports the cultural responsiveness most was Open SciEd. This had structured materials, and it was all part of the curriculum design and included having topics from MLL students and students with disability. And also, as part of this, educators recognized they also had limitations and they also had work to do. The third theme was assessment types used to support equity. And traditional assessments were, of course, used. They were modified and accommodated. Performance-based assessments allowed students to express their understanding visually, conceptually, or through diagrams, claim, evidence, reasoning responses, having scaffolding, having oral assessments, projects, formative assessments were noted to reduce pressure overall and also having multiple entry points. The fourth theme was the barriers to implementing equitable assessments, and those were curriculum mandates. These were typically predetermined. They lacked autonomy. The expectation was that all students could do near the same. And the time that's part of this to design, to modify, to grade, to analyze was a barrier in using more what they would consider more equitable assessments. The typical traditional assessments tended to be language heavy, they weren't equitable, and also that there was limited professional development that was focused specifically on equity, the lack of access to specialist and standardized assessments. For The research question two, I also came with 4 themes as part of the process, with the theme number 5 being the perceived effectiveness and that equitable assessment practices did improve student access, their confidence, their demonstration of their learning. It allowed students to engage with assessment and in content that aligns with their strengths. And again, multiple entry points available for students and leaving them with a less of a sense of failure. For theme 6, the most effective approach was modeling and phenomenon based assessments. They were highly effective. They allowed visual representation of relationships. It definitely reduced reliance on formal academic language and writing, and it gave them real world contexts. The 7th theme was what were the inclusion mechanisms, and those included student voice, agency, educator relationships was a large part of that. And students were more willing to express their ideas and take risks and make connections. They had ownership. They knew what to do as part of the process. And what I thought was wonderful was that they saw assessments as a caring practice. The last theme was the implications and constraints. And of course, if we're looking at systemic structures, they are going to limit the effectiveness of equitable assessments as standardized assessments rank students. Educators were unable to review test items. There was very little on test specifications. The current Washington Comprehensive Assessment of Science has less support than previous standardized assessments, and that NGSS actually lacks assessment guidance. This requires more work from the educator. Collaboration and professional development were helpful but limited. And in the end, I know, multiple of the educators just talked about how the process really was isolating for them. In the discussion for research question 1, the equity is a multiple pathway. This was realizing that students don't have the same needs, they don't have the same starting points, and equity responds and recognizes to these individual student needs as well as the systemic barriers that are there. There's a historical reliance on standardized assessments, on their educational frameworks, and the pedagogy. And those are gatekeeping methods that continue those historical patterns and prioritizing the sameness. With moving to a more justice-oriented responsiveness, this gives students a way to reflect their linguistics, their cultural, their cognitive strengths, and it cares for them as a person. The multilingual learners and the students with disability and historically marginalized, it cares for them. And there is uncertainty in how to design assessments that were specific to Indigenous and the BIPOC students. For recognizing the importance that students demonstrate their understanding using multimodal or option-based assessments include modeling, projects, oral assessments, phenomena. These align with NGSS and STEM parts. Equitable assessments emphasize scientific practices. It allows them to explore their experiential learning. It involves data analysis, taking data, designing solutions, coming up with explanations. And again, this is more humanizing and it honors the diverse populations. It also reduces the construct irrelevant barriers, which those interfere with students' ability to demonstrate what they know. For an example, multilingual learners, their linguistic responsiveness is treated primarily as an accommodation rather than an intentional assessment design. And that risks reinforcing the assumptions about students rather than recognizing their multilingualism as an asset. And educators demonstrated intentionality, though, and confidence in implementing equitable assessment practices for students with disabilities, for multilingual students, by translating, by accommodating, by modifying, and scaffolding work. As to the barriers, they are systemic and beyond the classroom. And this leads to practices and tensions between equitable assessment practices and accountability driven system. Time was a big factor. Performance based assessments require a large amount of time, and especially if you have large classes, 150 students. And that leads also to uncompensated educator time. The gaps in professional development in specific science disciplines were noted. The expertise becomes more individual, and having limited access to specialists and instructional coaches as well. But when they are available, it does bring more confidence to the instructor in their design and also working with them in interpreting student work and student meeting. The lack of guidance regarding culturally responsive assessments. And these questions also noted there was a question that the lack of culturally responsive assessment training cause unintended harm as the narratives of historically marginalized students were excluded. For connections to the critical pedagogy theory, there was emerging critical consciousness seen as educators were aware of traditional and standardized assessments, marginalized diverse learners, and educators had intentional efforts to move away from this uniform assessments to more multiple pathways. The dialogical practices, these practices, of course, are going to reflect a shift in power relations within the classroom, where assessment becomes that shared process within the meaning making, rather than an instrument of control. And that really spoke to the two-way processes between educator and student to student. For praxis, the barriers illustrated the limits of practices. If we're looking for critical awareness, that needs to be accompanied by structural support, and those barriers are oppressive structures. For the discussion and research question 2, the findings did indicate that equitable assessment practices do improve students' ability to demonstrate their learning meaningfully and authentically. There's a greater inclusion, there's more engagement, students are confident, they feel supported, and especially students that may previously have struggled with traditional assessments. The reduced barriers also shape students' identities, their self-efficacy, and give them a sense of belonging in school. The most effective practices, again, were modeling and phenomena-based assessments, especially with the real-world contexts. They were able to conceptualize relationships with scientific ideas and how their understanding over time was revised. Students' ideas and their thinking was made visible. It reduced the linguistic load. It allowed them to make choices, explain their thinking, and having that dialogue between peers and educators. It also aligns with how students learn science, which is that sense making, revision, discourse, and as well as genuine understanding. The conditions that support that equity are relationships. That was the utmost first part that was addressed multiple times. Knowing the student's background, their strengths, their needs, that builds trust and it enables them to have better self-efficacy and also more accurate interpretation of their work as well as educators' interpreting student work. Assessment then becomes that caring practice because it's grounded in dialogue, and students actually viewed themselves as more capable learners. The implementation of equitable assessment practices builds educational communities. It hopefully allows time to collaborate on topics when that collaboration is available, such as culturally sustaining pedagogies, and focuses on feedback that supports the educators and the student growth. The implications and limitations, well, standardized accountability systems are misaligned with how students learn science. They have high language demands, they constrain equity oriented classroom practices, and can increase anxiety in students and also undermine those inclusion factors, which hinders their academic development and their emotional growth. Professional development, collaboration gaps, and equity assessment practices rely on educator knowledge. And again, these are often developed in isolation. For research, the discussion to research question 2 and the critical pedagogy theory, again, educators perceive equitable assessments as effective. It makes their learning visible. They have dialogue, they have shared meaning making, they have agency and participation. And it also rejects that banking model where knowledge is deposited and measured using a standardized instruments. But those systemic structures create incomplete praxis. The classrooms without full institutional reform does not make changes systemic. But as part of that liberation, it does become more humanized in their learning and disrupts the power dynamics. For the limitations, all of my participants were white. They also taught in predominantly white schools, with only one school having a lower socioeconomic status. So that would be limiting the range of racial and cultural and socioeconomic perspectives. Not all educators had students which took the Washington Comprehensive Assessment of Science. So the findings for them reflect their perceptions of overall standardized assessment, but they did not have uniform or firsthand information. Underrepresentative, such as students that were part of the LGBTQIA community, were not spoken about as part of this, and that then limits how much understanding these equitable assessment practices would support them. And of course, this was self-reported educator perceptions. I did not have any student voice as part of this process, so that would limit the triangulation. The recommendations, well, prioritize modeling and phenomenon-based assessments, examine student outcomes, center students' voice and agency, strengthen the amount of professional development and collaboration, and of course, reconsider the role of standardized assessments. These are big ticket items. There's no expectation to revise a whole system. We cannot ask educators to change everything that they've invested, because these are invested educators that start conversations. So that would be the process. Earlier in the year, we did a professional development together with my department, and as part of that, we went through the entire Next Gen standards and made sure that they were all covered in the 3 years that students take science. Those were valuable conversations. Our school is undergoing a school improvement plan, and they are focusing on math and English as the smarter balanced assessments, because those are graduation requirements. Having conversations that make connections to what their needs are, understanding what are the professional developments that people want. It needs to be effective, but it also needs to be sustainable. And practices like ambitious science teaching, those practices are connected. You have peer groups that you can work with. And, with the goal being to increase knowledge together, to build bridges between departments, and, creating a simple roadmap to start these conversations, such as possibly using portfolios as part of assessments. So, in conclusion, this explored educators' lived experiences with equitable assessment practices and how these practices influence their perceptions of student learning, the inclusion, and also the difficulties that are part of it. Equity included multiple pathways. It includes modeling and phenomenon-based assessments, as well as connections with student voice and student trust, those relationship pieces. The perceived outcomes are going to be increased confidence, as well as more accurate representation of student learning. The tensions are there, standardized accountability pressures, the limited amount of collaboration in professional development, and the insufficient culturally responsive assessment guidance. These practices align with Freire's emphasis on valuing diversity, on valuing diverse ways of knowing, fostering student learning, their empowerment, their inclusion, which are precisely the outcomes beyond individual student learning that brings that equity piece and that justice piece alone. And that is the end. So I'm ready for questions.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Chris. We appreciate you presenting this evening. Very well done. I can tell that you're a teacher. Just by your cadence, your tone, your clarity. Excellent job with that. And I did want to just say on record, we appreciate you just overall. I know the struggles you've had over the past specifically 12 months, your own sort of personal hurdles, but you have not allowed those to become just a barrier to completing the program. So a big congratulations for that.
Thank you.
I am going to let Dr. Whitman ask her questions first, and then we'll turn over to Dr. Slink.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Grant. Chris, thank you. This is such a timely topic. As a sixth grade ELA teacher, I was just having a discussion with my assistant principal the other day about the failure of professional development, not only to target content area reading, but this dialogic type thinking that you're talking about. We're getting kids to think more critically, to open up and just utilize their background knowledge and their own experiences and understanding content area, the topics, the reading, the rigor that is present in all of that. It's just going to take so much more than a simple basal or a canned professional development program in order to get there. So thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. My first question, it's more so just a thought because I tend to, when I work with doctoral students, to really push the manual coding. What did you see as the benefit of changing over from in vivo or, your program to that manual coding aspect?
For me, it was just being able to see everything at once and to make notations as I was working. I felt like when I tried Navivo, it was just disjointed for me. I just could not see everything. I couldn't, that scrolling, trying between screens and, you have your coding here and your transcript here. I just did not find that to be effective for me. But also, I want to take this process in. I wanted to, not just hurry through and find my codes and get there. I really wanted to find the meetings with everything. And I needed to be able to see everything as part of that, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And your discussion of the trustworthiness aspect and the reflexivity that you built into that process. You spoke about your journal and you spoke about the reading the transcripts multiple times, being able to embed yourself within those participants' thoughts and then recognizing those repetitive phrases and words that built into your codes and themes. I think it's just such a powerful process. Did you use a particular program like Braun and Clark or another researcher, or did you just kind of develop your own process as you went along?
I developed my own process because that's the way my brain works,
Sure.
and I
Right.
just, would just type in this and that, and I would highlight, and then I would unhighlight, and then I would take things out and see if I saw them again. So and that just was the best way. And I didn't print anything out. I just was able to enter in my thoughts as part of that process.
Yeah. Well, organically, by creating your own process, you were able to come up with some really meaningful themes that aligned really well with your theoretical foundation. And that leads to my second question. Your theoretical foundation is reminiscent of a defense that Dr. Grant and I sat in on Monday with Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy, and understanding how that impacts his particular research was with high school students. And I was wondering if you could just speak to the power of alignment in that theory that you chose and how you think that fits so well with your findings.
I was trying to remember earlier today. I don't know if it was in the Roodstam and Newton or the Leedy and Ormrod text, but I believe it was one of those two that I saw the theory for critical pedagogy the first time. And the first time I saw it, it just was that instant connection because there's so much, power in the process of realizing not just, it's easy to look at that and say, oh, these and this and this and this is wrong. But what are the possibilities that we could do with that process? As a person, I grew up, my parents are immigrants. It was we were very poor, homeless at times. I became a wallflower in my classroom all the way through. I think the last time I was maybe engaged in learning other than I took Algebra 1 as a senior in high school, it was probably seventh grade. And past that point, I was not present as part of the process. And so when I just read through that, the importance of just taking down the oppressive structures, that means that kids aren't wallflowers. And that means that every single kid is capable of learning. They're capable of learning science. And when equitable science practices are used, it allows them to be their individual self as part of that process. So I think that that was probably, it was so action based. And the narrative of it spoke to how I try to be as an educator in having those conversations and not letting one blessed kid be a wallflower.
Well, that was an amazing answer. And I hope that when you take this out and you share your findings, that that passion breaks through to others because we are at a crux in education, as you are well aware, and things need to change. And I truly believe that the direction that you took your research in is part of that solution. So good luck to you in spreading the word and getting this
Thank you.
implemented. You're
Thank you.
welcome. Thank you, Dr. Grant. I'm done.
Thanks, Dr. Whitman. Dr. Schleicher, do you have questions, comments?
Chris, as expected, phenomenal work. I expected nothing less from you. So I want you to think, maybe not from an administrative side, but a futuristic side with professional development. Because as you mentioned, as Dr. Whitman mentioned, PD gets thrown to the wayside oftentimes. So how would you believe that your administrators, district administrators would implement your recommendations? And what do you think needs to happen with policy shifts or expectations to move to more of a systematic change? And that's a pretty loaded question, but I really just want to get your thoughts on it.
I think in one of the classes that we took, or that I took, you maybe took, we had to look for a video. And this video that I found was in a Canadian college where they just had this desire to implement equitable assessment practices. But at the same time, I appreciated that in that they weren't saying you're doing it wrong. And they weren't saying that you have to change all of your practices. And in fact, I remember one of their people that was in the seminar that they had given said, I already work hard enough. I don't know how to add. I don't want to add a whole bunch of things. And so that has stuck with me in the process of, making a roadmap. What are the needs? How can we take these pieces and make them simple and implementable in processes and not make people go, that was really cool, but I'm not going to use it. And I think that conversations between educators are just so valid. Taking the time in my department to have conversations. What does that look like? What would be your needs? We had a speaker come last year, and oh gosh, I was trying to remember where he was from. He was a Black and he traveled all around the world. And so he had great insight for students. So he talked to students and then he talked to us. But then those things just kind of fell off of that wayside. So I would be, implored to have those conversations again. But also with Indigenous culture, because Washington State is, of course, it's very Indigenous land. There were a couple of assessments that different instructors talked about. And I think that just bringing awareness as part of professional development is a learning part. And then creating a roadmap from there. I know that there's a college, I think believe it's Evergreen College here in Washington State, and they have gone away from using assessments and they build portfolios. So, can we have conversations? That has to be where it starts. But I think you have to also know what the needs are of people. What would they want? What would help them just even implementing any subject level, those individual pieces that have meaning to them, that are easy to implement, and that can be sustained as time goes on. Having time, we have professional growth Fridays. So every Friday, students are out by 12:12. And then a month, we are together. And I would say a lot of that time is not exactly effective. It's like, oh, here, read this article and have a conversation. But that process ends there. And I want those processes to continue. So it would be figuring out what people that I, know, moving out from there and being willing to have conversations with people at the district level. I'm very good friends with the Northwest ESD director, and he's fantastic in that process as well. So having conversations with him as well.
Wonderful. Just one more from me. So, how did you attempt or how did you include opportunities for your participants to give you diverse perspectives, even if they differed from what you are expecting for equitable assessment practices?
I think, if anybody was going to ask what surprised me the most, that was how profound those interviews were. There was not one that at the end of it, I wasn't moved from. I was moved from their thought processes and their struggles. And I think, in trying to create a safe space for them, I knew most of my participants, except for a couple I did not know well at all. But I think that creating that space for them allowed them to talk about things. There is one, participant who said, I do multiple choice questions, quiz every Friday, 5 questions. It's traditional. I'm not going to vary from that. But there's still value in that. And I think that they needed to know that no matter what they are choosing to do, there's value. And every single one of them was incredibly invested in their students' learning. So I think there isn't one way, there isn't one highway. There are many, many, many different pathways. And it's just becoming more knowledgeable about how we can help kids better, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. That's all the questions I have, Dr. Grant.
Thanks, Dr. Schleicher. So Chris, I actually had one of those same questions. Can you tell me about some practical applications that you could, do currently? You've kind of answered that. A second question that I have is, and I do frequently ask this, but as an individual who, you go into this process being, being passionate about a certain topic. I know this is the topic that you're passionate about. You talked a lot about your journaling and working through that data. But in what ways, if there were any, did you see your own sort of implicit biases coming through as you were working through that coding?
Oh my gosh, every moment, right? Because, initially I thought about not doing phenomenology and maybe doing action research. Sorry, that's the first time I messed up on that this time, but that's okay. I'm human.
It's a mouthful. It's a mouthful.
I thought about doing action research because I wanted to, just continue what are my kids learning and how is this helpful for them? And that's part of what I did with my master's. And I appreciated that you kind of, said, well, why don't you consider this other way? And, as if I were to have interviewed my students, like I already know what helps them, right? I mean, I don't know everything by any chance, but I would have expected certain replies as part of this process, because I see that. I see those light bulb moments in my classroom where I was just doing muscle fatigue following this phenomena this past week, and the kids were like, oh, so la 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 la, right? And so I know what works for me. And so in every single one of the interviews before I started, I just had to turn off my own thoughts as part of this and just take in the knowledge that they had for me, because we don't do a lot of listening, if you think about it, in this process, because we know maybe what works for us. And so I just said, in my brain, I took a couple of minutes before I started that Zoom, and I just made a mental note to not have my thoughts be part of what their information was. And I think that made that so much more profound, what they shared with me. And the same thing with my coding. I just had to go. It doesn't matter what I think, because it didn't matter what I thought. Doesn't matter what I find to be a working progress for this process, that I wanted to know what their thinking was as part of the process. And so, I mean, I'm sure, you kind of go, oh, yes. And I found myself in some of the interviews going, oh, wow, yeah, I like that. And then I stopped doing that because I didn't want to guide that direction at all as well. So, I don't know how not to have bias part of it, but I really tried hard to make it about what they were sharing and not what I thought.
Yeah, that's fair. And we all know as educators and your committee members on here that implicit bias is it's just part of the research process. So even when you're listening to an interview or you're transcribing it and you say, oh, that's what happened to me, or I think this thing, those are natural, naturally occurring. So it's nice to hear that. And then we're down to about 10 minutes, but maybe just in a minute or so, could you tell us just a little bit about how you have changed as an educator from the beginning of this process, doing this research project to now?
Oh my gosh. I feel like, I think for me, beginning the process, not really knowing what phenomenology again was, but that's okay. Not really understanding that process and just learning about that process, and then doing the interviews to talking, and then doing the interviews and then going through all of them and finding the codes and themes. I just thought there's so much value, again, in listening to what someone else has and what works for them, and making sure that that value is recognized as part of the process. I felt good about the practices that I have in my own classroom, but I realized, how much of that am I sharing with others? I mean, listen, anybody has access to anything I do at any time. They have access to my Canvas. They can look at those pieces. But I think realizing the time piece, the value piece, the sharing piece, and that listening piece has just had me grow as a person and realize, I mean, I don't feel like I'm ever going to be done growing. Part of me is sad that this process is done, where I have all of this structure, because it's been so powerful. There isn't anything that in this past year and in the classes that I've taken that I haven't learned something from. And I want to continue that. I want to be open to possibilities. And it also, I think it's given me the umption, and maybe a little bit of bravery to be willing to step outside my comfort zone and continue this process. And I'm not sure I would have done this without that process. I would have been just content in my world.
Well, thank you for that. That just really is almost the definition of the self-actualization in Maslow, right? Getting to that best yourself, continuous growth, growth
Yes.
mindset, and becoming the best version of you. So thank you so much for sharing that. I don't have any other questions. I've seen your work throughout. I think that you have a really solid project. So I will reflect back to Dr. Whitman and Dr. Schleicher on their votes for passing or remediation.
Pass for me.
Excellent.
Likewise.
Excellent. All right. And with that, let us be some of the first to congratulate you, Dr. Scott. Preliminarily, we are so proud of you. We know this journey was not easy for you in particular. If there is anyone on the call that would like to come off and congratulate Dr. Scott, you are more than welcome to do so. However, I would be remiss if I did not let you know, please do not change your email signature until you
know I'm not.
find document from Dr. Ballard.
878889.
Yeah, all the
Dr.
A's.
Nolan, I know.
All the A's until that. So, very good. Very good. All right. If anybody wants to say anything, you're free to come off mute and
congratulations, Chris. You're amazing. I'm so proud of you.
Thank you, Jen.
Congratulations, dear. You did it.
Thank you, love. He's the best husband ever.
Well deserved, Chris. Great job.
Thank you.
Yes.
Congrats, Chris. Wonderful. You did great.
Thanks, Jack.
Congratulations, Chris. Really proud of you.
congratulations. So proud of you.
Thank you. Oh, that was my dad.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining. It is even leaving me slightly verklempt. You have an absolute village here. You have an absolute village. And thank you to everybody on the call for supporting Chris through this past year. We are so proud of you. I will allow you to go have the rest of your evening, celebrate. And I will get all the documents you need. I'll send an email to you tomorrow with everything that you need, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Whitman, Dr. Grant, Dr. Schleicher. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Congratulations, Chris.
Job well done.
Thank you.
Congrats. All right. I'll have a good evening.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.